It is my great honor to introduce to you our Spring 2019 CHRC Distinguished Speaker, Dr. Robert Hornig. Dr. Hornig is a Wilbur Thrum Professor of Communication and Health Policy at the Edinburgh School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania. He directs Penn's Regional Tobacco Center for Regulatory Science funded by FDA and NCI. Between 2003 and 2014, he directed Penn's NCI-funded Center of Excellence in Cancer Communication Research. He has led the evaluation of more than 20 public health communication campaigns worldwide, including the U.S. National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign, or the infamous campaign we can call it right now. He is the author of numerous highly influential books, including the classic Public Health Communication, Evidence for Behavior Change, as well as more than 140 refereed articles and papers. He has served on 5 U.S. National Academy of Sciences committees, is a fellow of the National Communication Association, and received the Mayhew Derryberry Award from the American Public Health Association. I would add, this is a survey provided by Dr. Hornig, but I'm going to add, and I'm sure many of you will agree, that Dr. Robert Hornig is truly an iconic health communication scholar who has shaped the field of health communication as we know it today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Hornig.
Thank you all. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? You back there. You're in charge of making sure you can hear me. No? Yes?
You might want to use the mic.
Yes, it's better?
Yeah.
All right. Can I just do the being introduced as an icon is fun. I'm not sure whether it's deserved, but I'm very glad to be here. The opportunity to talk about the research we've been doing over the last 5 years is quite exciting. This is among the very earliest presentations of a lot of this work, particularly in this form. And so I'm entirely welcoming of feedback, of comments, as I would hope. Can I suggest that if you have substantive questions or questions about that I can inform you about as I talk, please raise your hand. I'm glad to respond to that. If you want to engage more deeply with the comments I make, let's do that at the end after I've done. So, but again, for clarification, you're welcome certainly to ask questions as I go along. There's going to be a lot of detail, and sometimes I will skip over detail that might be helpful. Okay. So really, I want to do 2 things. I want to talk about the idea of the public communication environment as we think about media effects. And then I want to talk about a specific study around the effects of the public communication environment on tobacco use. This was done under the auspices of the Tobacco Center of Regulatory Science, funded by the FDA through the National Cancer Institute. This is a talk that I give sometimes, and this version of it, and my long-term research director, Laura Gibson, gives as well, so she certainly deserves equal credit here. This says where the funding comes from. The research team is quite large. There have probably been 20 people involved in one moment or another in the ongoing project, and I can't, of course, describe every one of them, but this is a real research team project rather than one for myself alone. So, we have a fundamental hypothesis. Exposure to valence messages about tobacco affects behavior. In this case, smoking intentions and behavior. So I'm going to talk that through, show you the results of that. It's going to have a little number in the end, which relates those 2 things, but it's a complicated question to work through, and we'll spend some time. First, talking about theoretical issues, and then talking through the evidence that we've got from us. So first, this will be common to you, those of you who study public health communication. We're arguing there are three basic mechanisms of effect. That is, people are exposed to messages, they learn about the costs and the benefits of engaging in smoking behavior. They learn about the norms, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in their social circles. And they get some skills for either how to start or not start smoking. They get some self-efficacy, that is, the willingness or the ability to resist or actually engage in behavior. So those are pretty standard. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those right now. But as we think about this issue of how exposure affects behavior, we can think about it in a somewhat traditional way. That is, to think about effects that come from a single exposure and try to understand, if I expose you to this message, are you going to change your intentions or behavior or beliefs around smoking? But I want to argue, and maybe this is mostly an intuitive argument, that most effects of media on individual behavior don't come from individual exposures. They'll come from repeated exposure, consistent messages from multiple sources, which create what I call the public communication environment. That is, we're embedded in this messy public communication environment, and if our behavior is affected, it's because of what that whole environment says, rather than because of any single message, no matter what its content. We're going to call that on and off the PCE, the public communication environment. So I would describe that a little more elaborately as exposure to multiple old and new media sources, addressing clusters of related themes, happening over time, possibly reinforcing and possibly contradicting each other. Message are processed through social network and institutional context, not just, we're not affected just because we hear it ourselves and change our behavior individually, but because we have a social environment in which we live, an institutional environment which may also change because of media coverage. It may forbid smoking in classrooms. Our social environment may say, people like us don't smoke, all of which could have profound effects, and media can influence that process. And also individuals themselves vary in what they bring to that exposure, and because they vary, what they take from it will sharply vary. So there is this exposure, we think, to the public communication environment that we want to capture. And again, why is that relevant? What is it producing? Because of multiple exposures as opposed to single exposures, there are just lots more opportunities for learning about those benefits and costs. There are increasing opportunities to learn when an individual is ready to learn. So at the moment when they're ready, they're likely to see it because it's in multiple sources multiple times. Multiple sources saying the same thing adds salience of time and argument. So more heavily weighed when you think about a decision, because the media talks a lot about addiction and associated with e-cigarettes. Maybe when you think about whether you want to use e-cigarettes or not, you're going to pay more attention to concerns about addiction than if the media didn't cover that issue quite so much. Repeated exposure then also carry a normative message. If so many sources are talking about an issue, you're more likely to think everybody thinks this is an issue I ought to be paying attention to, or everybody's doing it or everybody's not doing it, depending on what the normative message is. Similarly, because it's out there a lot in the public media environment, public communication environment, it becomes a riper topic for personal communication. You're more likely to talk to your friends because everybody's talking about this topic at the same time, because the media are talking about it. All right, basic theoretical things, they're not, they're pretty intuitive, I think, but they may have real implications for how you might want to study the effects of media on behavior. So how do we study PCE effects, public communication environment effects? Well, you could do focused exposure experiments, show people a message and see what the response would be. But my guess is that's better for testing well-specified theories and less helpful for estimating effects of a messy public communication environment, of this complex thing that surrounds us. Or you could look at the correlation, the association between self-reports of exposure, how often you see yourself as exposed to this public communication environment, and your behavior, either simple cross-sectional associations or what's called lagged associations, that is, earlier exposure predicting change in behavior subsequently. There are various ways to do that, and I do it myself. A lot of my studies look like that. But I'm concerned, and many analysts are concerned with what's called the problem of endogeneity. That is the idea that if you ask me, am I exposed to messages about smoking, and you ask me, am I smoking, that there's likely to be a correlation between those two things, not because one influences the other, but because they're asked at the same time, the same measure, and there may be other variables, other what are called confounding variables, which influence both of them. And because of that, we worry a lot about making a strong causal claim from correlational data of that sort, even when we can incorporate over time analyses. And I can spend more time on that if people have questions, but at least it raises difficult problems of what economists call the problem of endogeneity. That is, self-reporting bias affecting both self-reports of exposure and self-reports of awareness. So, here's the logic. Could we escape from that problem in part by separating our measurement of exposure from our measures of smoking intentions and behavior? That is, measuring what we'll call opportunities for exposure to various media content. So instead of measuring whether you're individually exposed, we measure opportunity for exposure. That is the media content itself. We try to say, what is the media saying about smoking? And is that associated with people's behavior? We're assuming there that, in fact, your exposure is a function of what's available in the media environment. The advantage here is that media content can be measured independently of smoking intentions or behavior. You don't have to do it on the same questionnaire or the same instrument. You can do it separately. It's exogenous to your measure of intention or habit. And so what we're really doing here is using media content as a series as a surrogate indicator for exposure. And by doing so, we think we can reduce endogeneity concerns. So here's our model, parts of it. I'll have to look at that side. I guess it's washed out if we do. So there's this thing, the blue thing in the middle called the PCE, the public communication environment. And we're arguing it's made up of exposures to lots of different sources. We actually measure all of these sources on the left-hand side. The Associated Press, broadcast news, a bunch of different broadcast channels, major newspapers, 50 major newspapers, entertainment television. We took closed captions from all the television programs that kids, youth and young adults watch. Tobacco and e-cigarette advertising. Websites, blogs, popular websites and blogs, Facebook fan pages, YouTube videos, Twitter. Not all of them worked out. But you can see what we're trying to do here. We're saying each of those are indicators of the underlying public communication environment, what's there in the environment in general. We're trying to now, you see what we're trying to do here, we're trying to capture the whole environment. Because we're arguing a single exposure is not what matters, it's what the public communication environment is saying that matters. So we're trying very much to capture as much of that as we can. And then we argue that affects exposure, and exposure affects people's cognitions and behavior. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the piece of it I'm going to focus on today. So, we're going to show that media content varies in valence, that is, whether it's positive or negative about smoking, over time. And in fact, we'll use time as our unit of analysis. That multiple sources vary together over time, creating the common public communication environment. That is, Twitter and weblogs and major newspapers are telling the same story at the same time, and if they are, they're likely to reinforce one another and produce effects and outcomes. And that individuals whose intentions to smoke are measured on a given day will have been influenced by recent exposure to media content. The particular model that we use here is the past 7 days media content. So,
Are you willing to take a question?
sure.
Are you using self-report time measures from individuals, or are you using some other way to assess time exposure?
You'll see in a moment, we did a continuous survey over time. We have a new national sample every week for 3.5 years.
And in self-report?
Self-report on behavior, yes. Yeah, we're not doing measures of smoking. In fact, we end up using intentions as our survey-based intentions. So what we do here, getting into more detail of the study itself, we content analyze media content over 1,140 days for 9 sources. Characterize each text that appears in any of those sources as with regard to its valence about tobacco, saying tobacco is a good thing or a bad thing. And from that we create 7-day aggregated measures of valence. That is, what's being said in a given 7-day period across all those sources that we're talking about. We then simultaneously survey a large representative sample of youth and young adults, 13 to 25-year-olds. We get new samples every week for 162 weeks. They assigned each respondent the prior 7-day valence score. And then we essentially examine how well the content measure predicts intention. Do a little more detail. So we begin with the content analysis itself. So here's our corpus, as the content analysts, or the information scientists describe it. We gathered data between 2014 and 2017. We did essentially a census of all the sources that we measured, including broadcast news. We went to 9 different channels of broadcast news and looked at all their content. We had about 550 tobacco-related stories over that period. Associated Press had about 1,900 stories. Newspapers, the 50 most major newspapers, had 7,300 tobacco-related stories. The web blogs, which was the second largest area, Nielsen told us what were the blogs that were most read by youth and young adults. We looked at the most popular 100 of those groups and downloaded that, all that material, and there were about 12,000 of them, web blogs. Total of about 22,000 of what we're calling long-form text, that is, that were article length text, which come from those 4 sources. Separately, we downloaded 58 million quick tweets that showed up that were related to tobacco over that 3.5-year period, and about 3,100 videos that were tobacco related over that period. What I'm not going to talk about today is a parallel study we did with e-cigarettes. So we have an additional maybe 25% text for all of those that are related to cigarettes as opposed to tobacco. So we defined an anti-tobacco text as one that, the language of this is important. You understand the text to be mostly against tobacco use or against the tobacco industry as a whole. It discourages using tobacco. And pro-tobacco was you understand the text to be mostly supportive of tobacco use or supportive of the tobacco industry as a whole. It encourages using tobacco. So we're really asking, we're going to ask our coders to make holistic judgments about whether a text was pro or anti-tobacco. Problem is we have a lot of text, as you noticed in the previous slide. So how are we going to solve that problem? Well, we get it this way. We use Amazon Mechanical Turk as our coders. We ask them to code 2,000 different example texts or sample texts from our population of texts. Well, this is actually describing how the long form work is done. 9 coders coded every text, and they coded each one as either pro or anti according to the definition that I just gave you. We then took that data. If they said, if there was a substantial consistency among our 9 coders saying it was either pro or anti, we use then supervised machine learning, Python programming, to turn those crowdsourced labels into classifiers. That is, we developed and we told the computer, figure out what's different about these texts that were coded as pro versus the texts that weren't coded as pro, and separately these texts that were coded as anti versus texts that weren't coded as anti. So we actually have separate pro and anti classifiers. We then tested the hell out of these classifiers. We have an independent sample that we test to make sure that the developed algorithms actually work. And once we got that process done, this took a long time, we then applied it to the rest of the tobacco corpus. So every text then gets coded as pro or anti or both. Pro and anti. Could be, a text could be pro, could be anti, could be pro and anti, or either. This ends up with this big summary finding. About 56% of the long form text, that is from newspapers, AP, broadcast news, and blogs, were actually anti. For Twitter, about 30% were anti. And for YouTube, about 22% were anti-tobacco. You can see YouTube is a lot less likely to be anti than others. We actually have similar data for pro, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Can you see that? I'm a little worried about this one. All right. So this is an overtime analysis for the long form text with regard to pro and anti presence. So on the top, these dots, dark black dots, represent a portion of text in a given month that were anti. You can see it goes up and down a fair amount. Overall, it's not changing on average all that much over the 3 years. These are month-long data, but it does vary some. The ones on the bottom are pro-text. It doesn't vary any place near as much, looks like. Overall, long-form text is dealing with this issue less and less over time. This is what's there. But for the moment, the important thing to note here is that there is variation over time in how much each month, and actually we do this at the 7-day level rather than the month-long level, there is real variation in how much pro or anti-content, anti-content there was over time. We did the same thing for Twitter, which is up on the left. And here we can see much less variation over time. Twitter doesn't really vary a lot month to month. And YouTube varies a whole bunch. A lot of inconsistency over time. But for both Twitter and YouTube, you see a lot. The top line is pro, whereas for long form, the top line was anti. You can see there's a lot of pro information in Twitter. much less anti-information, particularly YouTube, to some extent also Twitter. So that's all the information we're going to be using for the next phase of our analysis. But before I go there, I want to show you one more slide. Really, two slides. And that's answering the question, do the media say the same thing over time? So our unit of analysis here is the week. There are 162 different weeks during our year that we analyze the content. And what we're asking now is, did, for example, this upper left-hand cell, in a week when the Associated Press had anti-coverage, relatively more anti-coverage, did major newspapers have it as well? You see a correlation of 0.37. Similarly, weblogs look a lot like major newspapers. They're actually correlated with Associated Press and with broadcast news pretty well. The interesting thing is, Twitter is moderately correlated, particularly with weblogs, in terms of showing the same story. The public communication environment, the extent to which these are correlated, is saying how much inconsistency there is across sources over time. What's striking here with YouTube videos aren't even slightly related to anything else. YouTube video content with regard to negative valence just as unrelated to Twitter or to any of the other major sources. This is the parallel analysis for positively valenced tobacco coverage. And once again, you're seeing some evidence of association, but again, YouTube doesn't work with the others. Twitter works a little better with positive valence than it does with negative valence. The mean correlation here across all the sources reading out, YouTube is about 0.34. The previous slide was the average was about 0.26. Okay. So now I want to present a limited set of the large number of analyses we are doing or will do. I want to focus just on evidence around effects of anti-tobacco valence coverage on smoking intentions. We do, just separately, we do have parallel content data about positively valence coverage, whose effects I'm not going to describe today, but also topic-specific coverage about addiction, about health consequences, about youth, about policy, about individual and population descriptive norms, and also a complete match set about electronic cigarettes, e-cigarettes. But I'm not going to try to present all that today. So now let's move on to the next phase, that is the effects analyses themselves. We did a rolling cross-sectional telephone survey of youth and young adults, 13 to 25-year-olds. Response rates around 21% phone surveys. We ended up with about 10,750 non-smokers and about 1,000 smokers. So we would then compare their questionnaire data from, for example, January 11th to their media data of developing the content analysis between June 4th and January 5th and January 10th. So the dependent variable in all these analyses I'm going to report is intention. For non-smokers, it's the question, how likely is it that you will smoke a tobacco cigarette, even 1 or 2 puffs, at any time in the next 6 months? 78% of this population said definitely not. And for smokers, the question was, how likely is it that you will try to quit smoking completely in the next 6 months? I mean, by completely, I mean not smoking tobacco cigarettes at all. And the answer there was about 20% said definitely will not. We did collect data on cigarette use, but for reasons of the logic of our analysis, we're not going to focus on that. We focus on intentions rather than cigarette use. The problem is with media coverage of a particular, smoking is asked about the previous 30 days, but then what media coverage should we be looking at in terms of current behavior? There's a mismatch in timing. There's intentions about future behavior, and it makes sense. But just in case you're worried about whether intentions can be trusted, do they, like, I want to argue you can, Here's some data. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned before, for about 40% of the sample, we re-interviewed them six months later. And so we can look and see whether someone who said they intended to smoke, or didn't say definitely not to smoke, whether they were likely to initiate smoking 6 months later. And for the smokers, when they said they were intending to quit, did they actually have a quick trial? And you can see a very strong relationship here between their intentions and their actual behavior over the next 6 months. The people who said, so the definitely not people, very few were smoking 6 months later. As I said, probably not, and up to 12%. The ones probably will, definitely will, was close to 50%. And then for smokers, those who said they definitely were not going to intend to quit, there are some of them, but certainly not very many, actually had a quick trial in the 6 month period. It goes up much higher, probably not, and then particularly for probably will, definitely will, nearly 85% of those who said definitely will actually had a quick trial for this intervening 6 month period. So intentions are relevant to behavior, we would argue. We looked at the effects of lots of our individual sources. We combined them into scales to make our analyses more parsimonious. This captures the association of the AP, BTN, News, Web, and Twitter with regard to a single underlying latent variable, past 7 day tobacco coverage. Tobacco ads and YouTube views essentially didn't correlate with the others, and are going to turn out not to have any effects either. Check it out. So here's the results finally we get there. All right. On the left-hand side are the results for non-smokers. What you're looking at here on the x-axis, this is a standardized scale of how much coverage people were exposed to in the previous 7 days. And you can see by the size of these bars that many people were down here at the low end of exposure. Relatively few were out here at high ends of exposure. And what this is graphing is the portion of them who intended to smoke as a function of how much media coverage was around. You see a significant, not huge, you would expect it to be huge, relationship here, such that the more anti-media coverage they were exposed to in the past 70 days, the less likely they were to intend to smoke. The odds ratio was 0.0. And that was significant, but just a really big sample. Interestingly, the effects were actually much larger for smokers, but they're marginal. They don't reach conventional significance levels. The odds ratio is 0.97 to 2.87, but you see a fairly sharp gradient here between exposure to anti-media coverage and the likelihood of quitting or having a quit attempt in the previous in this period. This analysis uses survey weights, adjusts for interview date, linear effects of interview, lots of potential confounders, such as age and cessation seeking and other things. Maybe a way of calculating the effect. So for non-smokers, it decreases from about 0.2 probability of intending to initiate, or other than definitely not intending to initiate, to about 0.15 as you move all the way out to the heaviest exposure. So that's the range of the change. For smokers, it goes from 0.82 probability of attending to quit up to about 0.92 probability of attending to quit with more exposure to anti-tobacco coverage. Obviously, there are many fewer cases for the right side of each of those distributions. We did all sorts of alternative specifications of models, and particularly the non-smoker result is pretty resistant to whatever specifications, robust whatever specifications we try. All right, discussion. First, there is some consistency, not absolute consistency, of anti-tobacco coverage among long-form sources and Twitter. Second, the scale of exogenous content predicted fewer intentions to smoke and suggests, but doesn't predict definitively, more intention to quit. The YouTube looks different than the other forms of digital content, and is much less anti, and doesn't seem to be associated with any of the outcomes. There are lots of limitations here. We don't have that many smokers in our study, there are 1,000 or so. We don't look here yet at pro-tobacco content, we only look at anti-tobacco content. That's particularly relevant when we come to Twitter and even more so for YouTube, where the content is often pro. So we haven't yet incorporated those into these models, but we will. We're looking at all content, all sources together. It may be that people who are heavy users of particular sources are more likely to be affected by those sources. So Twitter users, for example, might be affected by Twitter in a way that non-Twitter users aren't. So we're treating the whole media environment as a single thing. You could imagine that there could be differences. And also, of course, effects could be moderated by individual characteristics. Age, attitude towards smoking, and so on. Again, this analysis looks at everybody together. Finally, media contents are a noisy measure of exposure. You remember that early slide where I showed you media opportunities for exposure leading to outcome. But that association between opportunities for exposure and actual exposure is imperfect. Lots of people don't ever see any of this content. And therefore, we are at least at some risk of underestimating the effects because we're looking at a surrogate indicator for exposure that may not be that perfectly correlated with actual exposure. What to take away from all this last slide? The first thing is the assumption that what matters is that the PCE, the complex public communication environment, is what matters for effects. And so when we're thinking about trying to study effects of media on an outcome, particularly at the population level, we need to take account of the entire public communication environment. That the concern about endogeneity is a real one. If we don't successfully adjust for potential confounders, or the artifactual associations reflecting shared self-report biases, we could be overestimating effects. Use of an exogenous measure of opportunities for exposure may address that to some extent. Recognize the new possibilities for capturing the broader media communication environment. This stuff wasn't possible 10 years ago. The way we analyze this data to really capture the messy communication environment. But it's now possible to get more and more possible over time. For example, if you do the YouTube analysis, we aren't yet able to do anything in video. Over time, people will sort that out, how to do the video as well. But that's clearly growing rapidly. Both the growing electronic content sources and the power of big data content analysis. In this case, merging MTurk with sort of crowdsourcing, which is really what we're using it for, to labeling algorithms through supervised machine learning, which is just the technology that's growing very rapidly. And finally, the first evidence that we can show that the effects of the PCE on this messy public communication environment meaningful outcome at the population that affects the smoking prevention. But obviously, there's a lot more to come from all that. And I hope lots of organizations. Thank you.
First, thank you very much for the talk. I really admire the scope and subsequent ambitiousness of this methodologically. As someone who studies meaning myself, I'm always like, like experiments like are lacking in potentially external validity. But I think this really gets at some of that, and I really appreciate it. I'm wondering, you sort of alluded to more data, and so I'm going to ask, did you measure things like attitudes and subjective norms and perceived behavioral control?
Yes.
Yes? So here's my hypothesis. I'm wondering if I'm right here. A lot of the work on smoking, specifically smoking cessation, tends to show that perceived behavioral control ends up being a major factor there. But valence of media should be related, at least theoretically, to more things like attitudes. And I'm wondering if that might partly explain the difference between smokers and non-smokers in terms of their effects, or whether or not, secondarily, whether or not the valence of the media tended to predict attitude more than the other ones.
Yeah, so the answer is I don't know the answer.
Okay.
But we have the data that will allow us to address those questions. The next thing we're working on is a belief scale. That is called to see in general how beliefs are affected.
Okay.
We do have measures of lots of behaviors, but also substantial use of action, defined concepts. There's so many ideas we can test here that we need to do. Part of it is you want to think about the content that's relevant. Is it just valence that you would argue would affect attitude versus norm? Or is it in fact the normative information in the content? That is, to what extent there's repeated exposures to people smoking, for example, or rarely people quitting. That you don't see very much. It's hard to see that, but there's lots of exposure to people smoking. Will that affect normative beliefs? So one of my grad students is actually looking at that exact question right now. There's just so much we can go after. Another student, for example, is looking at taste of e-cigarettes as an emphasis in content, because often that's what's being pushed. Tasty, flavors and so on. What does that affect beliefs about the flavor, and particularly the association of beliefs about flavor and its intentions and behavior? That is, do they interact with content, affect the effects of belief on behavioral outcomes or intentions? I think yes, I appreciate that comment, and write me a note, and I'll steal it.
Sounds good. I've got one other one for you to steal. I'm just, I would love to look at this within the data, which is the sort of staggering of time effects, right? So,
I'm sorry, what time?
Staggering of time effects for the media specifically. One thing I've started to see people do with big data approaches is looking at sort of like how something that appears in Twitter might then start to appear in long form media in the next cycle. And that might have these really interesting sort of time effects for this.
Right. Again,
Could be
absolutely
fun.
fascinating question to what's lead and what's lag.
Yeah.
And with regard to media coverage, and just on the content side, leaving aside the survey side,
Yeah.
just on the content side. And again, certainly a question we've thought about, but we haven't yet taken.
Well, thank goodness you have such a large research team. Just divide and conquer.
Welcome. Yes.
When you use the anchored workers,
I'm sorry. I can't.
when you use anchored workers and put them in the machine learning, you mentioned like there were 9 classifiers. What were the classifiers?
No, there were 9 coders for every
9
text.
coders.
We did try various classifiers, so we ended up using a logistic regression classifier for our supervised machine learning. This is a collaboration with other groups, and so actually the Twitter and YouTube work was done in Chicago by the Health Communication Collaboratory, which is part of NORC, and they used they used actually a whole matrix of classifiers, and I can't tell you what, I can't name them all, but they chose what was the most efficient of the classifiers.
What were the most efficient or like significant clicker?
What features?
Yeah.
I can tell you that, but I can't tell you that. Because I don't remember. We do have a list of them available. If you drop me a note, I'm glad. Actually, my colleague Laura Gibson did a lot of that work, and we do have a list of the most attractive features for valence. And we'd like to share it with you. We were probably talking about 5,000 features in total, but you're talking about they were probably top 10. I'm sure somebody has that list. I just don't. Other questions?
Other questions? Yeah, I believe you've worked on past campaigns about tobacco use. So as people who are creating maybe one-shot messages or single exposure type of messages, what does this mean for us? Should we still be working on these campaigns? Should we be focusing more on regulating the content of the media environment? Should we just give up?
Well, as you know, half my life is spent on campaigns and research and evaluation around campaigns. Over time, I've gotten really interested in this question of routine media exposure and how that affects behavior. I think you can be interested in both. I do think one of the things we underestimate is, let me start again. One of the things, I said this to a group yesterday, but one of the things that happens in my experience is that the government in particular is often quite good at developing messages. They'll put money into message development, they'll test it out, they'll put no money into exposure because they won't buy any media time. Shockingly, if you don't buy media time, nobody's going to actually see the message. Or they say, I'm going to put it on YouTube, or my Facebook page. Nobody comes to their Facebook page often. And so, really, in some ways, the crucial argument here is about exposure. You've got to get enough people to see a message for it to have any effects. But our research has often focused more on the message per se and its development, and we're pretty good at that. As our advertising agencies often. They have some skill at doing it, but the problem of what happens when people actually see it. Some of you may know, right, Dr. Dan referred to this before, but one of the things I did was evaluate the National Anti-Drug Media Campaign. So the U.S. government spent $1 billion on that campaign. They spent $35 million on the evaluation alone. Huge project. And as best we can tell, not only was it unsuccessful, but it probably had iatrogenic effects, that is, boomerang effects. That is, the more kids were exposed to the messages, the more they were interested in drugs. There's even some evidence that the more they were exposed, the more likely they were to try marijuana. And we think the reason for that is, and that's really coming down to the issue you raised, is even though each message was carefully tested and had positive evidence, and some were rejected because they weren't so promising, when kids saw them together, they were, on average, kid was seeing 2.5 messages a week for a long period. They took from those, we think, a meta message, which was that everybody's using drugs. Now, you test a single message, and it works perfectly well. You test 50 messages, and all of a sudden, you're giving a meta message that's quite different. So we actually have evidence that the more kids were exposed to messages, the more they believed that other kids, or their peers were using drugs. And the more they believed that their peers were using drugs, the more likely they were to initiate themselves. Another example of that, my colleague Joe Capella and some of his students did a study. This was more of a field test, it was a field experiment. But it was a very intriguing design. They showed kids anti-drug ads a while ago. And they let a subgroup talk about it in a chat room after seeing them, versus a group that was asked their responses right away. And it won't surprise you a lot when you think about it for a moment that the conversation in the chat room were not positive about drugs. fun of the ads, and so on. And of course, their ultimate responses were much less positive than the kids who just saw the ads. And again, you test the ads in isolation, you might see a lovely effect. Either the accumulation of ads may have a different effect than each ad in isolation, or ads talked about, that is socially processed, might have a very different effect. So I think, well, I'm quite happy to work on campaigns and do, and develop methods for trying to think about what messages or what beliefs are most appropriate for campaigns. This has some important implications for thinking about, well, when you evaluate a set of messages, what are the possible ways it could affect the population that might be different than the ways they affect your people in your lab or in a controlled environment. They might just look different. Thank you.
Yeah, how do you decide to use 7 days as the window of Movie Explorer?
Yeah, we actually tried 7, 14, 21, and 30, and basically other days didn't add. If we went past 7 days, it just didn't help. Just empirical result, theoretical one. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the informative presentation. I just had a question whether this research or other research you have done on this topic. Thank you for the informative presentation. I was wondering if in this research or other research you've conducted on this topic or related topics, the appeals that you are using in certain messages and message framing, like for example, the fear appeal. I know that some research on smoking and anti-smoking has indicated that, for example, the fear appeal might in fact, in some cases, backfire. So you tell people, oh my God, every cigarette is going to reduce your life by XYZ. People go like, no, I have an aunt who has been smoking for 80 years and she's in better health than me. So I wonder if this kind of appealing and framing of messages did play any role. And thank you so much.
Right. So we have been actually quite concerned with the issue of, I would say, the themes of messages. I don't work so much on fear versus or gain friends or lost friends, and Dr. Nam works on. But I do worry about the theme. Should you're trying to get kids to not initiate smoking, do you spend time on their physical, long-term health consequences, or on their physical cosmetic effects, or the risk of addiction? So before the FDA did their real cost campaign, that's on the air now still, but in its beginning, they asked us to look at alternative themes. And we compared, I think, 21 different themes. This material is published, 21 different possible themes, like the ones I described a moment ago,
Right.
And made an argument for, we ended up arguing for addiction or control and for physical cosmetic effects as the most promising. So again, trying to, not fear versus gain friend versus,
Right.
but really across what beliefs seem to be most associated with outcomes. We developed a set of methods for doing that, we published, and that have been used for a number of campaigns to try to sort through what might be most promising.
Thank you.
So I still do work on campaigns, even though.
So you collected data, content analysis-wise, you have pro-tobacco information, but you didn't use that to predict,
Not yet.
Not yet, so
Yes.
you plan to do that?
So we tried with anti first,
Okay.
and now we've become convinced that we ought to be looking at pro. There wasn't a lot of anti in the long form stuff. I mean, a lot of pro in the long form stuff, but when we look at YouTube and Twitter, there's a lot more pro that's there. And so we think we ought to be.
What's your hypothesis? What kind of impact do you think the pro content would have on intention to smoke or intention to quit?
So you're making me predict. Huh? Are you running it down? So I think what's going to happen is the measures of YouTube events are not very good. I think that there won't be an association, not because there might not be, but because I think I'm worried a lot about. We don't code the videos themselves. We code the words around the videos. That's all we can do. And I'm worried that the stuff is not very sure. So I think if we do it right, maybe we'd be successful in showing effects of pro versus anti. And when the one is dominant, the other one is not, the effects are larger, and they're both present, they counter-argue. In a practical way, methodological way, I'm awfully worried that we don't have wonderful measures of pro. YouTube Twitter's a little better, but Twitter doesn't vary a huge amount over time. And so it may not be so successful. But of course, I could be wrong, I've been wrong many times. That's the advantage of having a long career, many opportunities.